说的就是那些蝌蚪什么的，是吧？这个有最新的，也有以前的老照片。这样的情况，我们学校都已经处理了。我们根据合同条例，还有国家法规来说，该处罚，该增加。
学校的领导人有堵，你看多少人，堵有几百个人家伙。
自治卫生院就是爆满，全是学生爆满，食物中毒。
肚子疼的情况之后，学校里报给教育局了，也在这个就近的医院进行这个治疗。目前的120车都出动了，那可能都是学生，反正知道是食物中毒。我们这边统计的都是120，咱接回来这些病人，好几个乡镇的，他那可能稍微轻点的，他就是拉到他们当地乡镇卫生院了；稍微重的，现在都拉到县人民医院了。
就只有都是一个餐饮公司共产的，所以大家看这是这么严重的情况。
所以说，这个今年的这个防汛形势应该说很严峻。这个我感觉这一次强降雨过程，今年应该是不是最后一次，有可能比这还会强，所以说我们要做好这个防大汛的准备，防大雾。
蘋果日報係95年係嘛？咁我喺96年尾係嘛入教區噶嘛，喺嗰度做嘢咧都需要睇報紙噶，個人報紙都要睇下嘅。最近咧乜都唔睇噶，你單單睇蘋果啦，一沓沓喺度啊，而家唔捨得抌噶啦。就我睇到呢本書仔咧好玩嘅。呢本書仔都幾出名嘅 ，Timothy Snyder on Tyranny。佢嘅題目就話 Defend Institutions。咁咩叫做 institutions 啊？佢呢個 institutions 咧就係包括佢話 a court、a newspaper、a law、a labour union。佢話呢啲 institution 你要支持嘅所以咧意思即係話咧你唔好太過樂觀啊！佢幫咗你好耐咧，可能有嘅時間你應該幫佢噶啦。但係咧又話咧唔好太嘅悲觀喎。佢話佢嘅題目咩？佢話 Be calm when the unthinkable arrives。有些嘢發生咧，你知道一定會發生嘅，因為所有嗰啲獨裁嘅政府咧都係咁嘅。你越驚咧，佢越容易控制你。呢本書教我哋話唔好驚啊，咁會發生噶。你知道咁會發生，你就唔使咁驚啦你又有準備啦。黎智英佢勇敢到傻嘅間添啊，佢真係唔怕死噶 我哋冇怕事人生都係為咗一啲價值唔應該為咗生命犧牲啲價值。每日一蘋果，冇人壓到我。
And in China, state-sponsored repression against all religions continues to intensify. The Chinese Communist Party is now ordering religious organizations to obey CCP leadership and infuse communist dogma into their teachings and practice of their faith. The mass detentions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang continues. So does the repression of Tibetans and Buddhists and Falun Gong and Christians. Speaking of China, last week I was humbled and honored to meet with several survivors of the Chinese Communist Party's massacre at Tiananmen Square that happened 31 years ago. I also released a statement on China's obscene attempts to take advantage of our domestic situation to press their political agenda, which I'm sure many of you saw. There is no equivalence between our two forms of government. We have the rule of law, China does not. We have free speech and embrace peaceful protest, they don't. We defend religious freedom, as I just noted. China continues its decades-long war on faith. The contrast couldn't be more clear. During the best of times, China ruthlessly imposes communism. And amidst the most difficult challenges the United States faces, we work to secure freedom for all. The China and so-called private Chinese entities have dispersed in Africa. China's contributions to fighting the pandemic are paltry compared to the financial and human costs of the cover-up that it engendered. And I note, too, our concern that China will exploit the pandemic as a pretext to continue its opaque lending practices that have led nations to debt and disappointment all throughout Africa. In Tiananmen Square 31 years ago, when thousands of people were massacred, instead they repressed journalists, they disappeared people.
A new bipartisan Senate subcommittee report says Congress should move quickly to strengthen the government's ability to oversee major Chinese telecommunications companies operating in the U.S. The report, called Threats to U.S. Networks, focuses on carriers owned by the Chinese Communist regime. It states that 3 Chinese state-owned carriers in operation in the U.S. for nearly 2 decades have only recently been scrutinized by various security agencies. The 3 are China Mobile, China Telecom, and China Unicom. The team behind the report is led by Senator Rob Portman, while Senator Tom Carper is the ranking minority member. Portman said in a statement that the Chinese Communist Party had exploited U.S. telecom's networks, and Carper said more has to be done to protect national security against spies and hackers.
The U.S. Federal Reserve has kept interest rates unchanged at 0 to 0.25% and said it would keep interest rates near zero through 2022. It also projected the U.S. economy would shrink by 6.5% this year, but bounce back with a 5% gain in 2021.
We're not thinking about raising rates. We're not even thinking about raising rates. So what we're thinking about is providing support for this economy. We do think this is going to take some time.
Following the Fed's rate freeze, the tech-heavy Nasdaq closed at a record high on Wednesday. It closed at over 10,020, up more than 0.6%. But the other U.S. indices were down. The Dow Jones fell about 1%, while the S&P 500 lost more than 0.5%. The CEO of a U.S. wealth management firm said the Fed is doing a good job, but has to guard against speculation.
So I think this is going to be an interesting balancing act in doing what's best for the economy, but also not creating any bubbles that could be detrimental to the economy down the line.
Today that the Prime Minister armed up against some of the more ridiculous claims that China had been making of recent times, including that Chinese students shouldn't come to Australia because, of course, we're all racist. Here's the Prime Minister in Canberra.
We're accused of being racist towards Chinese students.
Well, that's rubbish.
That's not Australian.
Well, it's rubbish. It's a ridiculous assertion, and it's rejected.
Look, it is nonsense, and I think it says something really significant about the dirty tricks that the Communist Party of China is prepared to use to get a geopolitical advantage. They'll steal IP to get ahead. They'll play games with confected concerns about quarantine or labelling laws to get an advantage in a strategic sense. They will spread misinformation about the safety of being in Australia to people who might want to study here to try and get some leverage over us, to try and economically coerce us. What I'm really proud of, though, is not just that our PM has, in his characteristic way, said, no, we're going to live by the values that we believe in. We're going to behave as a free trading nation. We're going to behave honestly, but we're only ever going to act in the interests of Australia and Australians. And the second thing that's wonderful is to see Chinese Australians outspokenly saying how much they love this country, how much they feel safe in this country, and making sure that message gets through back in China.
The Prime Minister was also asked today about the Belt and Road Initiative, the dirty deal that Chairman Daniel Andrews did with China. Here in part is what he said about that offensive deal.
It is not a program the Australian government has signed up to. It is not Australian government's foreign policy. And all states and territories should not be doing things that act inconsistently with the federal policy.
So is it too late? Can Daniel Andrews get out of it?
He should, because it's inconsistent with Australia's government policy.
Not good enough just to say it's a bad deal, get out of it. Something has to be done to stop it happening, because it is the Communist Party infiltrating this country.
You know, I think the question is so troubling, right? Because you ask the question assuming there is a moral equivalency between what takes place in these countries where they repress their people and they bludgeon their people and they burn down their religious facilities and they deny journalists, you all, the chance to ask a question of a Secretary of State. Just like the question you had the opportunity to ask me today and demand that we provide responses to you and hold us accountable. Those things don't happen in those nations. Our diplomats all around the world can be incredibly proud of the fact that they represent a nation that has God-given rights ensconced in our fundamental founding documents that ensure that when we get something wrong here in the United States, when something as tragic and as awful as what happened to George Floyd takes place, that the government responds. Right? We saw both local law enforcement and our Department of Justice move very quickly to address the particular situation. We've now seen people say, hey, we're calling for changes in the way law enforcement works. It's not my space here as the Secretary of State, but you can see this debate take place in America. That doesn't happen in nations across the world. In Tiananmen Square 31 years ago, when thousands of people were massacred, instead they repressed journalists, they disappeared people. It was fundamentally different. Our nation is so special. And it's the greatest nation in the history of civilization. It is so special that challenges like the ones that we're confronting here in the United States today will be managed head on. There will be a political process that's engaged in. There'll be wide open debate. And our core principles, the fact that we respect every human being because they are made in the image of God, will be reflected in the way that the United States responds to these challenges. And I actually think our diplomats have this incredible opportunity to tell this important story about how America confronts challenges inside its own country in a way that reflects the finest of what our founders would have hoped America could achieve.
Allegations of coziness toward China or even infiltration by Chinese spies are dogging the pro-Hanguoyu March scheduled to take place in Taipei this weekend. March organizers say it's a show of support for outgoing Kaohsiung Mayor Han.
But investigative reporters claim the march is spearheaded by pro-unification agitators. Some have even cast doubt on a KMT press release responding to Han's recall, saying it suggests a reluctance to openly oppose China.
It was the West Africa Squadron of the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, that put down the Atlantic slave trade after 1807, after the passage of the Slave Trade Act. And it was the people of the United Kingdom who funded that measure to take down slavery. And right now, whether it's here in the United States or whether it's in the United Kingdom, the far left are trying to erase that. But no mention so far, and I get all the team on this, no mention so far of the Arab slave trade, of the fact that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, not only had slaves, but recruited slaves. No mention of that so far. You're in the war room. Jack Maxey, Greg Manns, Raheem Kassam, Stephen K. Bannon. Steve?
By the way, no mention, you ought to talk about not just the Royal Navy, who put down the West African slave trade with that squadron, but it was also William Wilberforce and all the great members of the United Kingdom that fought for that for years and actually had the passage of that great legislation that outlawed the slave trade. So, you don't hear any mention of that whatsoever. It's stunning that all these politicians later, I think you said it was Gladstone's, they're trying to take down Gladstone's statue just for the fact that
rename it. Rename the Gladstone Theatre at Liverpool University, Steve.
Because his father owned slaves, or his grandfather, was that it?
Because his father was a slave owner. This is where we're at now.
Look, remember, President Trump says, where does it end? He said that back in August of 17, right? He eventually talked about the Washington Monument, Mount Vernon, University of Virginia with Thomas Jefferson. Remember, for the neo-Maoist left, the point of the revolution is the revolution. The issue of the revolution is the revolution. There's no set of terms that they're going to be satisfied with. You can't negotiate with them. This is why it's from the French Revolution. This is why it's from the Cultural Revolution of the Chinese, the Red Guards, right? You're seeing what the Red Guards were like. We've had them, and I want to make an announcement on Saturday for our special. We know we do specials every Saturday. 1 hour of the special is going to be on the Cultural Revolution. We're going to have voices of the Chinese people to tell you what it was like. And you know what's going to shock you? It's going to sound awful like what you're seeing today on television. So we're going to have people talk about the Chinese Communist Party and the Cultural Revolution, drawing analogies to it, but you're going to hear the voice of the Chinese. In addition, we're also going to discuss the firewall of how they keep control of the Chinese people. And so both of those are inextricably linked with today's topics and issues. But this Cultural Revolution is neo-Maoist in its nature, and you're seeing what the Red Guards are doing. I want to go now to, I want to talk about, yeah, go ahead, jump in, guys.
No, I was just going to say with Wilberforce, what shows you how dangerous this sort of neo-Maoist movement, this erasure of history is, when you kill God in this post-God nihilistic world, there's no redemption. And that's what Wilberforce is all about, right? I mean, his song is all about the redemption of man by a change of his attitude and his opinions. And this is really what we're trying to do here with these protests. But if we're going to make it so that nobody can be redeemed, there's no way to come out of this. This is why revolution is the aim.
What do you mean, the song being Amazing Grace? Look,
Amazing Grace, right. I mean,
the point of the revolution is the revolution. Remember this struggle, and we're going to get to Archbishop Vagano's letter here in a moment and bring in Ben Harnwell. But let me tee this up, is that, remember, what the fight is against is materialistic, secular, or atheistic, you could actually say, communism. Purely about materialism, right? Versus the forces of the Judeo-Christian West and others, believers in India, of Hinduism and Japan with the great religion. Remember, in China, the population, one of the biggest driving forces, the single biggest driving force of the freedom movement is around Tibetan Buddhism, around Islam, around underground house Christianity, underground Catholicism, Falun Gong, other spiritual practices, the democracy movement. The great point of Pottinger's May 4th speech was to tie together the great philosophical understandings of Chinese civilization with the West. So you're seeing as it becomes, remember, it's the signal in the noise, the signal in the noise. The signal is, this is about people that believe in the spirit, people that believe that we are united by common humanity and not separated by race. And these forces of darkness that are upon us that represent nihilism, represent this kind of materialistic communism. And I think this Archbishop Vagano's letter, Raheem, I'd like you and the guys to take over, but I thought it was very, very powerful. This was an open letter to the President of the United States that talked about the children of light and the children of darkness, and kind of what it meant as far as going through on a spiritual nature, why this is really spiritual warfare at the highest level.
对待共产党最好的方式，你就是透明，你就透明啊！你透明，你就是最强大的啊！就共产党的这帮情报傻叉们，哎，报告郭文贵在家里边和班农中国念宣言啊，傻了吧？现在又骗共产党了，我们可以把澳洲银行黑掉，叫他们投资全弄回。他素不知道，他这个行为给我们战友带来了无限的团结和致富的机会。 只是我们抓不抓住，只是我们坚不坚定，只是我们团不团结，你愿不愿意活得像个人样啊？就这么简单，一切取决于我们自己啊！新中国联邦干啥的？不是说非让大家找个地方，大家现在都在西方世界过得好着呢，干嘛去你建那个联邦去啊？我们的联邦就是一个保护所有的爆料革命的战友们和中国人的利益的一个这样的一个平台。有没有国号、国旗、权利都不重要，是你有没有能力造福这些中国同胞，你有没有能力保护这些同胞，你有没有能力团结这些同胞，这才是重要。